The topic of this panel is disparity, and when I accepted the invitation to comment on this panel, I assumed that we would be trying to link the issue of inequality and rising inequality in China with political change, with political instability, with social unrest, and so forth. What I'd like to do in my comments is to link some of the information that we've been given in these two presentations with these issues, the kind of issues that we were discussing in the previous panel and earlier in the day, and begin by noting something that I think everybody has noticed, and that is that this is an era of rising inequality in China. Strikingly, remarkably large increases in overall levels of inequality, whether measured mathematically by Gini coefficients, which have more than doubled in the last 15 or 20 years, or the emergence of some spectacularly visible social differences and inequities in China. And we've seen rises in grievances among the populations that are clearly on the losing end of some of the changes in recent years. Especially in large groups, and potentially worrying, especially among large groups like industrial workers, people who were relatively protected and sheltered in the old state system, and rural farmers. Also, rural migrants, although I think I'd have to ask Cindy Fan whether she would put the migrants among the losers in the process of reform. We know that they suffer from any number of indignities relative to the urban population, the urban registered population, and they clearly are second-class citizens. But I notice in a recent issue of the China Quarterly, an income survey by Kahn and Riskin, following up on their previous two income inequality surveys, for the first time covered migrants to the city and showed that they were doing very well relative to rural populations, although they hadn't quite caught up with registered urban populations. So I wonder whether, in some sense, the migrant population might be included among some of the winners of the reforms. Levels of inequality that we observe in China and social differences that have emerged are of a magnitude that have not been seen since before 1949. I think that's a statement that cannot be challenged. Xiaoguang Wang details this, and if you know Xiaoguang's work from the 1990s, the early 1990s, he was one of the authors who was most concerned about these kinds of trends. And Xiaoguang is pointing out two things of note. First, one that I think all of us have recognized, at least since the last Party Congress, and that is that the government is much more concerned about these things and is instituting policies to remedy them. But he's going a step further in pointing out that the state has the capacity now, the fiscal capacity, and the ability to fund programs that actually do turn these trends around. And in fact, his last few graphs show that in recent years there's already been an impact. I don't have the knowledge to question his portrayal of fiscal trends in China, but the fact that an author like Xiaoguang Wang, who was writing in not quite alarmist terms, but with very serious concern about the loss of central state capacity in China in the early 1990s, appears to have changed his views, and that I think is something to take note of. What I would like to do in the rest of my comments is to build on the foundation of these two presentations and try to link the question of inequality with some of the larger political issues that are on the table. And the connection is through the rising wave of political protest or social protest in China, which Merle Goldman already brought up in the question and answer period earlier today. That's related not so much to the outcome that we were concentrating on in the previous panel, which was an outcome of whether China democratizes or changes its regime type. Usually the issue of mass protest is connected to the issue of political stability, and those two things are not the same, not at all the same. They're two separate conversations. as Andy Nathan was pointing out, we need to be quite clear about what argument we are having. You can't pick up a newspaper in recent years, and I usually pick up the New York Times, and you can't pick up, don't look at me like that, David, and you can't pick up, you can't, don't listen to me. And you can't pick up a scholarly journal, and I usually pick up the China Quarterly, without reading documentation of the striking rise in the rate of social protest. The number of 80,000 or 87,000 protests usually precedes every article that I read in the New York Times about the latest protest. And actually Merle Goldman quoted that figure about an hour and a half ago. These events clearly indicate rising discontent on the part of those who are losers in major structural transformations that are now sweeping the Chinese economy. Now, the reform process in China has not been continuous. It started out very hesitantly, especially in urban areas, but it's accelerated since the mid-1990s and has begun to move to a serious restructuring, for example, of the state labor force. Lots of layoffs and rising unemployment in urban areas. Perhaps most disturbing about many of these protests is that some of them are being met with violent and deadly force by local police and militia, in some cases by private thugs hired by companies with ties to local corrupt officials. These are the kinds of events that have garnered the most attention in the press. A common theme of all these reports is that a rising tide of popular discontent and protest, if not checked, will threaten China's political stability. And the recent changes in government policy in the last party Congress seem to suggest that China's leaders believe this as well. If China's leaders clearly are concerned about these trends and they're taking steps to promote a more harmonious society, shouldn't we also believe that they're a threat to stability? I think we need to point out, before I try to answer this question, that the sources of conflict appear to be new. The kinds of protests that have been reported are disputes over losses of rights that were previously guaranteed to the population up through the middle of the 1990s. And they reflect the wrenching changes that accompany the restructuring of China's old state sector and the spread of the market economy deep into China's hinterland. Three categories of protests that are prominently reported are by state sector workers who are idled due to the decline of the previously dominant state industrial sector. Several examples of this are workers who are recently idled who claim to have been cheated out of their rightful compensation by their firms. Protests by pensioners who find that they're unable to collect from bankrupted and closed firms. These are largely urban protests, and they're concentrated in regions where these declining state firms are concentrated. A second major source are due to structural problems in the rural sector. Earlier, say 10 years ago, the protests centered on the imposition of additional extra legal fees on farming households that occurred in the wake of a decline of the fiscal income from township and village governments. In recent years, the more explosive protests have been due to expropriation of land for non-agricultural development, basically peasants being kicked off the land and being given insufficient compensation or being cheated out of the compensation that they were promised, by corrupt local officials. A final category that we see on occasion are protests by urban residents in the low-income regions of China's large cities that are kicked out of their homes by rapid commercial real estate development, and again are also denied the compensation that they feel they are due or were promised. These are the kinds of causes behind the recent wave of popular protest. You could also add students who are, more recently, students who are promised a certain kind of college degree and a fee-paying university degree, and then find they get a very different kind, 5 minutes. No, you promised me 20 minutes because there's only one discussant. It's true, I was promised double time. These,
we'll give him a few extra.
Yes, okay. These are the causes behind the recent wave of popular protests. So the question is, what's their political significance? Will these kinds of protests, with these kind of sources rooted in rising inequality, rooted in among populations that are losing, will they have the kind of political impact that we should really be concerned about? This depends on the nature of the grievances, the size and the political relevance of the population, and whether the protests involve strategic populations and therefore threaten to shake the regime's base of support. This requires me briefly to tell you what I mean by what kinds of protests are politically consequential, what the regime's base of popular support actually is, and what we mean by politically strategic populations. What kinds of protests would be worrying, would be the kinds of things that would potentially threaten political stability? First of all, protests that harm production and exports, or protests that damage China's economic performance or made China a less attractive location for foreign direct investment. These would have to be located in China's leading business and export sectors and would affect major ports and railroad lines. A second kind of protest would be those that involve the core constituencies of the regime. And by core constituencies of the regime, I do not mean workers and peasants, and we can have this discussion later if you want to argue that these are, or ever have been, core constituencies of the regime. The core constituencies of the regime are party members, of whom there are 70 million at last count, and lower-ranking government functionaries, of whom there are, I've got the figures later on here, but it numbers in the millions. Also, core constituencies, although less directly, are groups that have benefited the most from the rapid growth of recent years, especially white-collar workers and educated professionals who've been largely absent from the recent protests, and workers in rapidly expanding export sectors. If the people in these groups begin to participate in protests, then you have serious political concerns. The most serious kind of protest would be sustained mass demonstrations in major cities, in particular Beijing, which force the regime to confront a choice of whether or not to use armed force. This was the choice the regime faced in the spring of 1989. And if this occurred, and I will make a prediction, if this occurs again, it's much less likely than in 1989 that the decision to use force would be made once again. This in turn would likely result in a splintering of the national leadership, which already happened in 1989, of course, and perhaps would rapid changes in the country's political arrangements. This claim leads me to ask a fundamental question: what's the primary basis of the regime's support? And I'll skip over the information about the 47 million party members who hold no political office and the political functionaries at the grassroots, and move to the question of, which I see as the most important support for this regime. Then, who are politically strategic populations outside this? And they are, in brief, the winners of the recent reforms, those who have improved their housing arrangements and incomes in recent years, and there are many, many people in this category. What leads to their acceptance of the regime? The most obvious is a higher living standards and upward mobility. Less obvious is a general sense of national pride in China's rise in economic and political power. Under present circumstances, these groups generally accept the regime's claim that current political arrangements are the only currently tenable ones that can provide stability in the current era of rapid economic transformation. So long as things continue as they have in the past, these groups will continue to give their tacit consent to the regime, if not active support. However, these groups are concentrated in the major coastal cities and in the nation's capital, and that gives them political leverage that other discontented groups lack. Having said this, how serious is the threat posed by the recent wave of protests? They don't have any of these features that I've just pointed out as being having important political impact. First, they don't involve politically strategic populations. The primary participants have been farmers, unemployed workers in failing industries, pensioners, residents of dilapidated urban neighborhoods scheduled for redevelopment. The participants have not included current employees of China's growth sectors or any of the populations that have benefited most from the reforms. Second, they're not located in strategic regions or enterprises. Rural protesters are scattered throughout China's vast territory. 80,000 incidents of protests spread over 850,000 villages in China is not a very big number. The protests by laid-off workers are concentrated in isolated Rust Belt regions. They achieve real critical mass only in Liaoning province and certain company towns. This makes coordination and alliances very unlikely. Moreover, these rural regions and Rust Belt towns are far from leading political and commercial centers. Third, the grievances of these groups are all focused on specific local issues. In the previous panel, I think people already pointed out, and I agree with this very much, that protests are usually directed at local officials and not at the central government. They're usually targeted towards specific enterprise managers or local government officials. Laid-off workers target their former employers. Farmers target local officials and enterprises. Protesters, as the work of Kevin O'Brien has shown, and as I think he said earlier today, protesters often cite central regulations and appeal to the central government in support of their position and petition higher authorities for help. The localized nature and focused targets of all of these disputes, as numerous as they are what make for such dramatic and entrenched resistance by these protesters, but these same features also lessen their implications for politics on a national scale. Fourthly, and finally, the motives for participation sharply differentiate the affected populations from others. Laid-off workers have sharply different interests from their former comrades who remain employed. Even in the same regions and enterprises, those who are fortunate enough to retain their jobs do not strike in support of their former comrades. Farmers who have not been forced off their land are still actively farming, have crops to tend, and businesses to run, and they do not risk their livelihoods to join in protests on behalf of unfortunate others. In short, the specific nature of these disputes, which seriously affect only those directly affected by them, greatly reduces their potential national impact. What kinds of changes would stimulate protests that would have a larger impact and affect the central government? First would be unemployment shocks in growth industries, especially the export sectors. This could come either from a rapid drop in demand for export products or a banking or financial crisis within China. A second type would be a renewed bout of serious inflation. Inflation is much more politically destabilizing than unemployment because it affects virtually everyone. Inflation was a serious problem in China in the 1980s, when unofficial rates reached upwards of 20% per year late in the decade. And during the '89 demonstrations, it was a major source of urban discontent that led to widespread popular support for the demands of student hunger strikers and later mass resistance to martial law. It's often forgotten that the Solidarity Union in Poland began as a reaction not to hardship and unemployment, but to a rapid and sudden price rise in 1980, which affected everybody at the same time. And because it affected everyone and cuts real incomes across the board, it unites entire categories of the population. A second, and I'll go very quickly, a second would be an external political shock, which would be caused by an obvious and humiliating failure of the regime to stand up for China's national dignity. Someone's already mentioned Susan Shirk's book, China, a Fragile Superpower, and this is a central theme of that book. China's leaders feel very much compelled to not show weakness in international relations because they're very much worried that they'll be seen as weak and humiliated. The upsurge of patriotism and nationalism among coastal urbanites in recent years has been founded on a sense that China is rising in world affairs. Sporadic but emotional urban demonstrations by students against Japanese textbook policies or actions regarding the Diaoyutai Islands or the bombing of the Belgrade Embassy show that international affairs can have a major impact on strategic urban populations. The most likely source of a large external shock would be over the question of Taiwan independence. should the Chinese regime permit itself to be maneuvered into a situation where it felt compelled to attempt a show of military force, and if that show of force failed or resulted in a humiliating defeat, serious anti-regime sentiment would be the likely result, even among party members and basic level functionaries. Moreover, the result would be a splintering of the top leadership and perhaps political changes similar to those that followed from the failed invasion of the Falkland Islands that finally led to the fall of the Galtieri regime at the end of a long period of military rule in Argentina in the early 1980s. But as we speculate about what might bring about serious political instability, it becomes evident that this is far from what we observed in the recent wave of protests. This is a different group. I'll finish. This is a different group, but it also brings us back to the theme of contingency, which is just because we're observing a long and seemingly stable rise of China, there are certain kinds of events that can lead to sudden and rapid and major changes in the political landscape and can shift the base of protest and its impact in very important ways. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.